across the board is that this is a really, really tough problem to solve. It's owned by so many different folks out there that getting ownership for any particular organization is difficult, and solving the problem is absolutely tough. What we're going to need to do to solve this is begin at the bottom level with individual citizens. Movies like the one you saw, I think, are very useful for reaching out to the average person at home. It gives them an idea of the importance of something like this. We need to look at the municipal level, the county level, the state level, and the federal level. But we cannot count on the federal level solving this problem. This is too big. This is nationwide. We're going to have a multi-pronged approach to finding solutions to this very, very important national security problem. And in terms of doing that, our panel here is well situated to come up with some ideas. And just briefly, I'm going to introduce them. General Ken Chrosniak, sir, thank you. Ambassador Henry Cooper, who's been very active in this in many ways for many years. General Robert Newman, sir, if you could, and of course you've heard Paul Stockton, and Captain James Terbush. Sir, thank you very much. And with that, I'm going to turn it over, and I think we're going to start right over here with General Chrosniak.
Well, thank you, sir. And it's especially, it's great to be, it's a real honor to be up here with the panel that's here, and especially with my idol, Dr. Stockton, over here. So I remember he came to the Army War College to the DDE class of 2012 and gave on 23rd of July. I remember I have your speech memorized. When you said that EMP keeps you awake at night, I mean, when Secretary Panetta had asked you to come over there and talk about the Title 10, Title 32, and NYG-Ret fault and so on. And that really perked our interest quite a bit at the Army War College, because it raised it to a different level with our commandant. The bottom line up front, I was asked to talk about EMP preparedness for the military, or survival. And I agree with Dr. Stockton that response is the big, that's the long pole in the tent, to use a military term. And for emergency or regional catastrophes, and they're catastrophes. If you owned a bar in New Orleans, it's a catastrophe when it was underwater. I mean, but as a regional catastrophe, the U.S. military is admirably prepared to do that. We have well-trained, staffed, exercise plans with NORTHCOM, our North, National Guard Bureau. They do a very excellent job, and we've seen that. However, the military is not prepared for a cataclysmic event such as if it reaches that level that we just saw a few moments ago. And our base is a maximum maxims complex catastrophe, whatever you might call it, but I call it a cataclysmic event, almost a tragedy. But as Dr. Stockton said, we can attack this elephant and bite it off bite by bite, and actually walk it down to the base and mitigate as much as possible. You're not going to mitigate everything, but you can, like Congressman Frank said, you can take it into small bites now and hopefully have some impact to save. We're going to lose a lot of lives anyway, to save some lives, quite a few. I'll focus on 3 areas quickly. With my few years of military service, I've noticed that the most important things that I picked up with my few years of study this, not as much as the other gentlemen here have been studying it, is basically on troops, training, and communications. First one is troops. You need people. You need people identified, you need them trained, and so on, and we do not have military personnel right now, probably within NORTHCOM, within our North, and so on. We have wonderful SBRNE forces, chemical, biological, radiological, nuclear enhanced forces out there that are very good at what they do. The state adjutants generals, General Newman had the home response forces and so on, and they're excellently trained if they can get out the front gate. But there aren't that many of them. What you're eventually going to need when, as Dr. Stockton said one time, when the state governors call FEMA and say, send us all you've got, and the state, and then after a while, they send them everything they've got, and then the FEMA director, Craig Fugate, contacts the president, and the president calls the SecDef and said, send me everything you've got. Eventually, we're going to need general purpose forces. General purpose forces will not be trained to go into this no-notice pickup game. Some of you have been on some football and baseball teams when you were younger. You just had a little pickup game, but you have to have what I call training now. You have to be able to at least acclimate and make these forces aware of what kind of environment they're going to be going into. Now, the SBRNE forces are trained for this, and some of the home response forces are trained, but you're going to have untrained military forces going into multiple regions, not just one region, maybe all 10 regions, maybe 4 or 5 regions, but what do you do in the military? You always plan worst case situation. So all 10 FEMA regions are involved. Let's just say it's a cascading effect like the National Geographic blackout. All regions, all at the same time, over vast urban and suburban areas, multiple jurisdictions for a very long, prolonged period of time, maneuvering within a humanitarian disaster environment with overwhelming mass casualty, graves registration, sanitation, medical needs, without the benefit of the defense industrial base, because you're going to need those critical just-in-time logistics providers and so on to be able to bring products and so on into the defense industrial base to be able to resupply the military. Resulting very little situational awareness, which is essential for the GPS for those forces, because your position, navigation, and timing, a lot of the radios are synced to the GPS, synchronization and so on. Loss of air traffic control. I can go on, but you see this all within a radiologically and hazmat contaminated environment. And being a first responder myself, with a fire company and rescue and a vice president of the ambulance company in Carlisle, small town, we still run 8,500 calls here, even in that small town. But you're going to be overwhelmed. And you have to be able to sync, as a military commander, you have to be able to sync that in with FEMA. And FEMA, Craig Fugate, about a year ago, put out a wonderful, I'll give it to Chuck to put on the web. In fact, I was going to try to put it on behind me, but I didn't want to take up too much time than I am already. But he put out a wonderful scenario called Critical Communications During and After a Superstorm. And basically it boils down to this. After 30 days, even the plain old telephone system, everything is down, except those that are operated with HF, Mars, ham radio operators, and so on. As long as you have power for your generator, you'll have HF line of sight. But we in the military, we deal BLOS. Everything's beyond line of sight. It goes through satellites and so on. And when Bill Murtaugh, we know you start discussing satellite scintillation and so on. And I'm going to wrap it up. One more sentence. The other one was training. If you can actually start training people, at least develop plans and scenarios for a nationwide magnitude of which we have no plans right now, and start exercising them, at least, and get a lot of the smart minds in here to incorporate some of their ideas on how we can at least respond and hopefully mitigate the loss of lives that are naturally going to occur anyway. Sir.
General, thank you very much. Ambassador Cooper.
Yeah. I want to link back to the first panel this morning just a little bit with what I say. I want to address 2 issues. One is I'll call it the threat from short-range missiles off our coast, including from the south, as well as the satellite launch that was mentioned by Jim Woolsey. The good news, as far as I'm concerned, is the Senate, if they get around to passing eventually the Defense Authorization Act, which is under consideration now and is supposed to be passed in the next couple of weeks, it will demand that the Secretary, or instruct the Secretary of Defense, to come back with a program recommendation for how to improve the East Coast defense, including against threats from the South. And it's my belief that the Department of Defense, below the Secretary, is prepared to deal with this question. So many of the issues of concern, I believe DOD may address over the next year or so. It's appalling to me that they've let it go this far without dealing with the short-range threats, since we've known about it for well over a decade. And there are options. There will be a lot of talk you'll hear about needing a new site for missile defense along the East Coast, extending all the way to Ohio is one of the places being considered. I'll let you think about why that is. And I would just want to make an observation that the Aegis ships that we have deployed, and last year, a day at random would have found 4 to 6 operating or in port along our East Coast, have the inherent capability of shooting down ICBMs that come at us over the North Pole. We demonstrated that by shooting down a satellite in 2008, I believe it was. So all that is needed is a radar up in Maine to make this happen. If you move the one that exists, and I forget what Army base it is, to Maine, it would cost like $20 million. If you bought a new one, it would cost like $300 million. A lot of money, but chump change in the broader scheme of things, and certainly far less than building a new site. And we could overnight have defenses for those of us who live along the East Coast from threats from the north. Our ships can also defend against short-range missiles if they're nearby, and that is the case when they're in ports as well. So it's a matter of training in that case, and the Navy can certainly provide that capability if, in fact, they're called upon to do it. The problem, a key problem, is that none of our ships operate in the Gulf of Mexico, so we're wide open to threats from the south, whether they come from vessels off the coast there or from Venezuela, which has ties, as you may know, to Iran and other places. And that the other thing that was mentioned was a satellite threat. If the Iranians or North Koreans choose to do it, they can overfly the range capability of the defense interceptors that we have, and we have none directed toward the south now, and the ships can provide interim capability for that. We need, ultimately, I believe, space defenses to deal with that, but that's years away for other reasons. Enough said about those. The second issue I want to come back to is the theme that was talked about by Ken at the end. I believe training is a key issue on the response side to deal with this problem, and training beginning with the local responder community. And I believe the cohesion that the National Guard can play, including linked back to the missile defense world, where they man the sites, as you may know, in Alaska and some of the command centers around the country. So the basic infrastructure exists within the National Guard that's linked into NORTHCOM and the federal level. And the Guard itself is made up, as you know, of firemen and police and doctors and whomever when they're not in Middle East or wherever, and they're working from home. So you have the inherent ability of integrating the local responders within the Guard if we simply prepare. And I believe training is needed. In South Carolina, I'm working with the Deputy Adjutant General there, and been working for a number of years. And we intend to put together an exercise. This meeting had been week after next, I could have told you a little more about the plan, but it's our intention to involve the inherent capabilities in South Carolina and neighboring states, perhaps extending to all of FEMA Region 4, which is headquartered, if you're familiar, in Atlanta. And with Bob Newman's help, who knows the Adjutant General of South Carolina, maybe we'll come to Virginia and even Baltimore as we think about a scenario to be included in one of the normal National Guard scenarios, Vigilant Guard 2015. And it's my intention, at least, to encourage thinking between now and the execution of that exercise with intermediate steps that can be taken to help train the community of people right now who have, maybe it's not zero understanding, but it's closer to zero than what is needed understanding of what they will be called upon to do if we have a blackout situation from any number of threats. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. General Newman.
Thank you, Rich. It was said by some famous American that all politics are local. Well, you've heard it also said that all disasters are local. And those of us that have experienced the need to bring disaster relief to our fellow citizens understand the meaning of this. When you talk about first responders of what I call first responders of consequence, those people that can bring a lot of stuff to help relieve an emergency situation, you're talking about the National Guard. Now, we're often guilty of assuming that everyone understands that the National Guard is a dual-headed organization, and you hear terms like Title 10 and Title 32 thrown out. Let me simplify it for everyone so we're on a common sheet to begin the discussion. The National Guard has two commanders. During times of peace and when they're not mobilized under federal orders, their commander-in-chief is the governor of each state, or the Commonwealth of Puerto Rico, or the territories. So we have 54 tags, 54 National Guard units. In that capacity, in the Title 32 role, which is U.S. Code, Title 32, the Guard is funded for all its training, for all the equipment that it uses by the federal government. But it takes all that training that is used for the war fight to go to Afghanistan and Iraq or whatever a Title X mission, the President will direct the Guard. It uses those capabilities, those trained resources, those Guardsmen, airmen, and soldiers to do whatever the Governor determines that they will do. In the other role, and this is where most of us think we know the National Guard, you'll see them in Afghanistan. You'll hear about a Guard unit returning, or one that's departing, or one that's serving over there. And we think that the Guard is the reserve of our country, and they're over there fighting the fight against the bad guys, and that's true. But in this context, and in the discussions we've had over the last 2 days, I think it's obvious that the National Guard can play an important role, not only in preparing to defend against a catastrophic, or as Ken said, a cataclysmic attack. Did I say that right? Cataclysmic attack. But also to help recover from one, which I think is the real challenge, as Secretary Stockton was talking about. I can tell you now that at least from my time, and I've been out of uniform for 3 years now, the National Guard was not ready for this mission. We had not planned, we had not trained, we had not exercised to the degree necessary to handle a cataclysmic event. Now, sure, we had units that could do that, and we had partnerships with other states through emergency assistance compacts. We had partnerships with the United States Northern Command and others, but on an individual basis, I can tell you that the Guard was not there. And we've seen how difficult it is on this mission of preparation for a cataclysmic event, whether it's an EMP or a cyber attack, something that puts us out of normal society for more than 30 days, let's say. The feds just don't seem to get it. Or, as Dr. Stockton said, or maybe it was Rich or someone, this is hard to do. Rich, I think you were talking about that. There are a lot of cooks brewing this stew, and a lot of people with money and power, and of course that not only breeds conflict, but an honest discussion with often seldom results in good success. I like to suggest that the National Guard is one of the vehicles that this group should embrace to help us prepare for a cataclysmic event and then to respond for one. Here are a few reasons why I think we should do that. First of all, 90% of the time the National Guard is under the command of the governors. And the governor is a powerful political elected leader. He has immediate call in to the president. He has immediate conversations and regular discussions with our CODEL, congressional delegations, if you will, the senators and representatives from the state. He has, through the National Guard, relationships with the Department of Defense. He has, through his Homeland Security Advisor, relationships with DHS, and it goes on from there. And on the state level, he has accessed a number of important agencies, such as his fire programs people, his Department of Emergency Management, those people that actually plan and operate the emergency forces during a disaster. He can access these folks, sell his ideas, the necessity of a properly prepared defense, and then response capability if he chooses to do so. I think that the mission of this group should, through the Guard and through the governors, just as Secretary Stockton suggested, to build from the bottom up the message that we need to get out and prepare better and to prepare our forces to respond. And I think that if we take that away from our meetings here over the last 2 days, we will have accomplished a great deal. I'll conclude my remarks by saying that Ambassador Cooper and I are going to visit with the Adjutants General at their February meeting here in Washington a couple months from now, and we plan to discuss this to start the ball rolling. And I think that from the response that I've received from the few tags with whom I've spoken, there is a great recognition that this new mission needs to be embraced more boldly than it has in the past, and I predict we'll have great success. Thank you, Rich.
General, you went 10 seconds over.
Take that out of Dr. Stockton's remarks.
Thank you.
All right, very well. Captain Terbush, sir.
Yeah, let's see if this works. Well, great. First of all, I wanted to say thank you. Thank you to Chuck Manteau and InfraGuard for inviting me today. Thanks also for including me on such a distinguished panel. I get to work at NORAD and United States NORTHCOM. I work in the Science and Technology Directorate, and this is one of the projects I've had the opportunity to spend a little time on. I want to make 3 quick points today. Let's see, I have 5 minutes and 10 slides, so it should be a piece of cake. Okay. Number one, the health consequences of these threats, EMP, solar storms, and also cyber attack, are significant, and significant for health because of the specific vulnerabilities that health critical infrastructure, that the public health and medical sector are subject to. Second, the health sector is not fully prepared, and we could go on with numerous examples, but I think Superstorm Sandy will highlight particular healthcare vulnerabilities and some lack of preparation. And the third thing, the third very quick point that I hope to make, is that both of these vulnerabilities require change to policy, so non-material and material solutions. So changes to infrastructure, hardware, if you will, alone are not going to do it. So how did we get started? Well, in conjunction with the Johns Hopkins School of Public Health and also the University of Pittsburgh Center for Health Security, we wrote a couple of papers on this subject, and I will go ahead and make reference to this book by William Fortune 1 second after. I describe it as a terrible book, but in the context of a terrifying, terrible book. And so it had, and I'm a public health doctor by training, so it had 3 public health scenarios through my reading. The first one, of course, was the effects on people who are in hospital or in long-term care facilities or rely specifically on life-saving medication. That group is the first to succumb to such an event or such an environment, let me say. The second group had to do with considerable loss of life associated with social unrest. And the third had to do with the society coming back to the carrying capacity of the land. But the first threat, the first public health die-off, if you will, was of particular concern to me. So I mentioned this collaboration with Johns Hopkins and UPMC, and we did a literature review, and it turned out that there really has not been much written about this subject. The Millennium Bug was good for a few articles, and then in 2003 there was also another article about health consequences of a cyber event. But really this is an unplowed field. So many of you have seen this slide before. It talks about the vulnerabilities and interdependence of critical infrastructure. I would highlight that both civilian and military capabilities rely upon these infrastructures. And Dr. Stockton has made this point many times that over 90% of the services to military bases, and so that would be energy, sewage, food, transportation, et cetera, we rely upon the civilian sector just like you do. And I would particularly also include the fact that our telecommunications, if you will, our IT backbone, we ride on civilian infrastructure just like the rest of you. A series of cascading failures could interrupt some mission-critical functions of the military, and this was in essence the beginning of this project. We tried to link some of the mission-critical functions that our boss, General Jacoby, has here in the Homeland, and that would include such things as force protection and, by extension, force health protection. Well, that gets into where we in the medical business, if General Jacoby doesn't have healthy troops to send in to respond to a disaster, there'll be some lack. So how can we improve the resiliency of military medical facilities? That's the essence of this project. So health is a mission-critical function. And it turns out that military healthcare facilities are just as vulnerable as civilian ones. This one shows, there are 16 now, 16 critical infrastructure sectors. It was mentioned earlier that they rely upon each other, but that healthcare and public health is particularly reliant on power and IT. It turns out that the way we practice medicine now in the 21st century has come a long ways from even 20 years ago, and now particularly information technology is embedded in pretty much everything we do in health and medical. So these are some of the health consequences, and I'll run through this list very quickly, but you know there's a requirement now through the Affordable Care Act that we do electronic medical records basically for all patient encounters. The medical supply chain and the just-in-time delivery system is absolutely reliant upon web-based systems. Pharmaceuticals likewise, billing and administration. We had a friend of mine go into the hospital not too long ago and was asking for immunizations, and she was told, I'm sorry, we can't give you your kids their shots, our computers are down. So we are very reliant on this. Imaging, lab results, certain medical equipment, health communications, emergency responders, this was mentioned already, are increasingly technologically driven. And finally, as you can imagine, a dark, hot hospital is a very unsafe place to be. So these consequences, these health consequences, may be mitigated. Most hospitals have a power system. Most hospitals will have auxiliary power in the form of generators, but as we saw from Superstorm Sandy, they would tend not to last more than about 3 to 5 days, if for no other reason than the requirement to refuel. But these systems also need to be maintained. Longer term, these threats, solar storm, cyber attack, and aging infrastructure. And I'm glad to see that the EMP SIG also looks at other significant threats which could bring down the grid, such as pandemic. I have one last slide here. Let me just go ahead and say that military is not immune. We have some hardening, if you will, but definitely need collaboration, cooperation, communication with the private sector, and transitioning of some of these mitigating projects that we have started in the military to help make bases more energy resilient are the way to go. So I'll leave it with public-private partnerships as the key message. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's very difficult to have this many distinguished speakers talk about an issue of this level of importance in the time allotted. But you know, the good thing is that now you have an opportunity to ask some questions. So I would like to open this up.
When you do the questions, I'll need to steal one of the mics when you're ready. Maybe his, and the panel is theirs, and you can borrow theirs.
Okay.
You can use one of the mobile. Oh,
So if you have questions, please raise your hand, and we'll.
Keep it brief so we get as
also,
many questions in as we can.
Yes, as many as we can. And if you could say who the question is addressed to. Yes, sir.
I'm Alan Roth, and it's addressed to whoever dares to answer this question. But we talk so much of a disaster occurring based on, let's say, cyber attack, EMP, and other things. But I haven't heard much about multiple faceted attacks. If China has infiltrated our infrastructure through the internet the way I've heard they have, and they're just waiting for the right time, wouldn't that right time be when we're having a heat wave or a deep freeze or a major nor'easter coming up the coast or other really bad things going on at the same time? How much planning, how much thought goes into your work that includes this factor of having multiple things happening at the same time?
Well, Alan, I think that's a very important consideration, and it's been taken into account for some time. I believe it needs to be considered even further. So you've mentioned the possibility that an adversary would have ample warning of a storm approaching the United States, such as Sandy. But I would say we also need to think about a combined arms attack. That is, the possibility that a cyber attack would be supported by a coordinated kinetic attack with improvised explosive devices or some other kinetic means on critical components of infrastructure. To have those two events occur simultaneously could present exceptional challenges rather than one threat vector alone.
I'd like to add the thought that, and to remind you that during the Cold War, when we worried about the Soviet Union attacking the United States, we planned literally to deal with an EMP attack as a precursor attack on the United States, basically with an attempt to shut down our ability to communicate with our strategic forces. And when I say our, I mean supporting the president's decision. We spent an awful lot of money on hardening that system against electromagnetic pulse. We didn't spend a penny on hardening the critical infrastructures to support the Homeland defense mission for a whole lot of other scenarios. And I hope that the current Department of Defense continues to support the testing and the surveys and all the rest that are assured to needed to maintain a hardened system of communication in our strategic forces. But I have to tell you that we've shut down a lot of the testing vehicles that we used during the Cold War to save money or for whatever the other reasons are. So I worry about whether or not we have maintained even the capability that we worked enormously hard during the Cold War to achieve to deal with a precursor attack. And as was stated here, if China or someone else is going to use this EMP, if you will, as the primary mechanism, I think you can surely count on cyber and other activities as a prelude.
Okay, we have a question in the back here.
Frank Turner. I was wondering if the panel would comment, please, on, we've heard the perspective from DOD, we've heard from the states. Can you talk a little bit about what you think your specific roles and responsibilities would be, especially all the way from prevention through response, and how you would pass command and control back and forth?
Sounds like a guard question. Well, I'm not sure.
Frank, I think the Guard, as I'd mentioned earlier, has the responsibility to plan for all contingencies. And this is a unique disaster that awaits us. So we need to do better planning, better interaction. You know, the whole of government approach used in the OCONUS discussions now has application to the states too in this. We need to train with our fellow responders, whether it's at the federal level or at the state level. And then we need to exercise to make sure that we can press to test and the circuits are connected. I think the key here is this is not business as usual. The events we're discussing here over the last couple of days are events that are going to task perhaps not a state but the entire region, maybe even the entire country. If we're not prepared for this in significant training exercises, we're sure not going to be prepared to take it on when it actually happens. So I think we need to have a different paradigm when we discuss these types of emergencies and develop training exercises to ensure that we have the capabilities to do that.
Thank you, sir. And that's very true because the military does really great at planning for the last war, and you stay within your own comfort level, like a good staff officer will. But this is really thinking out of the box right now. So this will open up a whole new brain shift. I'll be nice. A whole new paradigm shift of planning. So this is going to be unique, especially but it's got to come from the top down. Or, like I always say as a combat engineer, best way to take a bridge, this is not a bridge too far, I think. Best way to take a bridge, according to Robert Redford, was to take both ends at the same time. You attack it from the senior leadership, the 30,000-foot level, and you attack it from the tactical level of people, just an uprising within the people to contact their first responders and saying, what are you doing, National Guard unit commander, what are you doing to protect us from an EMP? What are you doing? Then have it all the way go up through the FEMA Fusion Center and work its way up and work its way down.
We have a question in the middle of the room.
Don Donahue from Diagenic Group and the American Board of Disaster Medicine. Dr. Terbush you touched upon healthcare, medicine, and healthcare. There are hyper-logarithmic advances in technology, and there's federal policies that are basically pushing us. It goes beyond critical infrastructure. It could be down to the individual. My pacemaker, I don't have a pacemaker, but my pacemaker can be remotely controlled. I'd like the broader panel. How do we address that? How do we address it? Becomes a very individual and broad-based technological challenge. Yeah, I can't protect my hospital. How do I protect the 10,000 people that I support?
Take that. Well, thank you for that question. There are numerous examples of medical equipment which are vulnerable to hacking, if you will, cyber attack. Pacemaker, you mentioned, ventilators. The one example I would use is that Kaiser Permanente, that has a footprint all over the country, bought some 8,000, I believe, IV pumps. And it turns out that these new sophisticated IV pumps can be programmed remotely from someone at a terminal and so on. Their IT security person at Kaiser Permanente, to their credit, decided, no, we're going to go ahead and instead fat finger every one of those just to obviate that possibility. This comes under the area of cybercrime, and those are issues, but they tend to be one-at-a-time issues, or could be one-at-a-time issues. The more significant thing is that medical equipment pretty much across the board has a computer chip in it. And if there was something that, such as an EMP or extreme solar weather, that could affect a majority of those devices.
We have time for one more question before maybe we give Dr. Stockton or anyone else a last word, because we have literally like 1 minute. I see one. Okay. Identify yourself.
Hello, Tom Popick, Foundation for Resilient Societies. This is for Captain Terbush. You mentioned something that's very intriguing, which is the carrying capacity of the continental United States. There is some disagreement, I think, that if we were to have the electric grid go down and not come up, what would be the casualties? And there's been estimates all over the place, 2/3, 90%. It sounds like you've done some kind of a more detailed study, and I wonder if you could tell us about that.
Well, a friend of mine taught me the use of the word dystopia as opposed to utopia. These dystopian scenarios, no, I haven't studied a great deal, but it turns out that the population of the United States, say in 1850, before we had benefit of power grid, and certainly before computer chips, was significantly less, probably less than 1/3 of our current population. I don't know where you take that number, but in the 1850s, we did know how to do things that we don't know how to do now.
All right, shall we open it up for any last closing comments that you'd like to make?
Chuck, let me thank you, Infragard, but everybody in the audience. This constitutes the coalition of the willing, and we are willing to make progress. Let's stick together and continue to not treat this challenge as something that's so large that progress is impossible, but that chunk by chunk, we're going to do what it takes to help defend the nation.
Yeah, I have one thing I left out because I was closing on my allotted time. I mentioned that we were vulnerable to threats from ships off the coast in the Gulf of Mexico and couldn't do anything about it. We can deploy the same kind of defenses that we're putting in Romania to be operational by 2015 and in Poland by 2018 at military bases around the Gulf of Mexico. And I'm working with the local folk and universities and the state governments to try to make that happen. Thank you.
Sir, I do just have one more thing.
Please.
I just have to say this. I think people are the soldiers, the troops. I'm thinking the response. It's actually the carbon-based unit that's got to show up and actually go on out there and do the recovery and so on and help his or her fellow citizens. And that's where the long pole in the tent is, because I said I wasn't going to. I talked to a battalion commander who just got back from Iraq not long after I did, and we were discussing EMP, and he's a local battalion commander in the state of Pennsylvania, certainly won't mention his name, who said, I'm not even going to go to the armory. My men probably won't show. I'll be home with my family where I belong. And that came from a highly decorated Stryker battalion commander. And it really struck me then, this is about a year ago, right around the time of the NDU exercise. And that's the way they're going to think. Unless you give them some hope, give them some training, they think they're going into an overwhelming environment. I don't care if it's National Guard, Army Reserve, General Purpose Forces, or Suburni. You are going to go into an overwhelming environment, an unknown environment. If you start training, make up scenarios, which should have been done a long time ago, from the DHS and so on should have been done a long time ago. The 2008 EMP Commission report has been out for 5 years now. What's been done? That's what the troops need, the response forces.
All right. Very sobering panel, but could we give them a round of applause?
Thank you, and we're going to prepare now for the next panel. You have a 3-minute stand-in place break.